Today I'll be covering Chapter 10 from the textbook, which is on visual imagery. So visual imagery refers to the ability to recreate a visual representation of a stimulus in the absence of sensory input. In other words, when you can't see that stimulus. In Chapter 1, Goldstein describes some scenarios to explain the different areas of cognition we'd be looking at in this course. The example he gave for imagery was realizing that you forgot to bring your cell phone with you to class and saying, "Darn it, I can see it sitting there on my desk at home where I left it." Your ability to see your cell phone when it isn't actually in front of you is an example of visual imagery. Similarly, to answer these questions, you would use imagery. You would picture the visual image of the stimulus or stimuli you're thinking of to answer these questions. What I'm going to focus on for the visual imagery portion of today's PowerPoint is the imagery debate between Koslin and Pilishin. The question at the center of the debate is, are mental images stored using a spatial code that is in picture form or a propositional code that is in language form? In class, I begin by asking students to close their eyes and to form a mental image of a motorcycle. Then I ask them to describe their mental image. All of my students say that in their mental image, they see a motorcycle and the parts of a motorcycle. And note that both sides of the imagery debate would agree with this. That is, when you form a mental image of an object or scene, what you experience is a visual picture of that scene. The question in the imagery debate, however, has to do with how the mental images are represented in the brain. That is, the information has to be stored or coded in the brain somehow. The spatial coding side says that what is stored is a visual picture of that information, while the propositional coding side says that what is stored is a verbal description of the objects and their relations to each other. For example, if you were to store a mental image of a triangle, the spatial coding theory would say that you would basically store a picture of that triangle in your brain. On the other hand, the propositional coding theory side would say that you store a verbal description of the parts of the triangle and their relations to each other in the brain, something like 3 lines connected at approximately 60-degree angles. Similarly, if I ask you to store a mental image of a cat being under the table, the spatial coding theory side would say that you store this information in a spatial pictorial representation like so, while the propositional coding theory side would say that you store a verbal description of this information like a tan and fluffy cat. A tan cat with a fluffy tail is under the dark brown table, so a verbal description. So to reiterate the differences between these perspectives then, spatial coding theories say that mental images are stored in the form of a pictorial code, that basically we store a picture of an image. So if you stored a mental image of a robin, spatial coding theories would say that you would basically store a picture of a robin in your brain. Accordingly, these theories predict that there will be a large overlap in the brain between the areas involved in perception and the areas involved in mental imagery. It also predicts that responses to real objects and mental images of those objects should be similar. This is how we're going to test to see which theory is correct. In different types of studies, we'll have participants make responses to real objects and then to mental images of those objects. Again, spatial coding theories would say that mental imagery is very similar to perception, and so they would predict that people's responses to real objects should be very similar to their responses to mental images of those objects. On the other hand, propositional coding theories say that mental images are stored in the form of a language-like code. So if I asked you to store a mental image of a robin, propositional coding theories would say that your image is based on a verbal description of a robin, where you would use language to represent the different parts of the robin and the spatial relationships between those parts. Again, both sides would agree that when people experience mental images, we do so in picture form, but the propositional coding theory says that when they are stored in the brain, they are done so using symbols and language. Think about how photos are stored in your computer's memory. There isn't an actual picture in your computer, instead they're stored as a pattern of zeros and ones. When we open the image, we see it on the screen in a picture form, but this is because we use a special computer program to open that image. Similarly, propositional coding theories say that mental images are stored in language form, and the mental process of visual imagery converts them into a picture form when we think of them and form a mental image of them. The key prediction of propositional coding theories, then, is that responses to real objects and mental images of those objects will often be different. For a basic example, form a mental image of a tiger. Once you're done that, answer this question for me. How many stripes does your mental image of the tiger have? Okay, I bet you're having a hard time answering this question. The idea is that if you're looking at an actual picture of a tiger, it's fairly easy to count the number of stripes it has. So if your mental image was truly in the form of a picture, you should be able to count the stripes just as easily in your mental image of the tiger. But you can't. This suggests that your mental image of tiger isn't in a picture form. Instead, propositional coding theories would say that it just contains the description striped. The textbook talks about several areas of research on mental imagery that support one of these two sides: research on mental imagery and rotation, mental imagery and size, mental imagery and distance, and mental imagery and ambiguous figures. I'm going to discuss these last two areas of study on the PowerPoint. First, let's do a demonstration of mental imagery and distance. So what I want you to do in this demonstration is to form a mental image of the map of Maryland. And specifically, I want you to imagine 3 locations on your mental image: Frostburg, Frederick, and Baltimore. While maintaining this mental image, I want you to form a mental image of a black dot and then move that dot from Frostburg to Frederick. Then I want you to move that dot from Frostburg to Baltimore. Now here's the question: which took longer? Did it take you longer to move the dot from Frostburg to Frederick, or from Frostburg to Baltimore? And then finally, the other question: which 2 cities would take you longer to move between in an actual map of Maryland? Okay, so here's the idea. What you probably found is that when you move the dot in your mental image of the map of Maryland, it took you longer to move it from Frostburg to Baltimore than from Frostburg to Frederick. Notice that in a real map of Maryland, it would also take you longer to travel between Frostburg and Baltimore than Frostburg and Frederick. And so we have support for spatial coding theories. Responses to real objects and mental images of those objects are similar in this demonstration. Specifically, in both mental images and real objects, it takes longer to travel greater distances. The study by Coslin on imagery and distance described in the textbook is just a more formal example of this demonstration. So in this study, participants learned the layout of an island with various objects at different distances from each other. So here's the map they learned, and you can see that the island contained different objects: a well, a hut, a tree, a beach, etc., that were different distances from each other. Then, after learning the layout of this island, the participants imagined traveling between these objects, and their time to do so was recorded. So the researcher would say, imagine traveling from the well to the tree, a short distance, or imagine traveling from the well to the beach, a much longer distance, and the time it took them to do so was recorded. The finding was that the time to travel between imagined locations increased as the distance traveled in the image increased. So in the graph, we can see that the greater the actual distance was between objects in the map, the longer it took participants to travel between them in their spatial image of the map. And so, these data suggest that participants are traveling between locations in a pictorial representation of the map in their mental image. That is, their response to the mental image of the map was similar to what their response would be to a real map. The greater the distance between locations, the longer it takes to travel between them. This research thus provided support for spatial coding theories, as it's an example of responses to objects and mental images of those objects being similar. Now, let's look at imagery and ambiguous figures as an example of an area of research that supports propositional coding theories. What I want you to do is to form a mental image of this figure. So here's a question I want you to answer about this figure. Does it contain a parallelogram? That is, does it contain this shape? If you're anything like the students in my face-to-face class, you either have trouble deciding or maybe you got it wrong. The shape actually does contain a parallelogram. You can see this clearly when I show you the shape, but again, you had trouble making this decision using your mental image of the shape. So people are generally poor at identifying other shapes in mental images, but not in actual images. In the actual study, people correctly realized that the shape contained a parallelogram only 14% of the time. So the idea here is that if you truly formed a picture-like image of the shape, then it should be just as easy to tell if it had a parallelogram in your mental image as if you were looking at the actual shape. However, it's much more difficult to tell in your mental image, suggesting that you didn't store the mental image in a picture code. Instead, you likely started using a propositional code, Maybe the verbal description was something like two triangles, one pointing up and one pointing down, or a Star of David. And so it's more difficult to figure out if another shape is present when that's how the image is stored in your brain. And so again, this suggests that mental images are not stored in a picture-like code, and thus provides evidence for the propositional coding side. As another example, form a mental image of this rabbit. Okay. Now, tell me what other animal shape was present in that image. Most people can't find the other animal in that mental image if they had never seen that picture before. On the other hand, if you look at the actual picture of the image, you can find the other animal, the duck, fairly easily. So again, this supports propositional coding theories, as it's another example where responses to real objects and mental images of those objects are different. I'm going to switch gears now and talk about cognitive maps, which are a mental representation of the relationships between landmarks and the environment. So we're not talking about mental images of objects themselves, but instead the relationships between objects in a mental image. For example, your cognitive map of the Frostburg campus would consist of the major buildings and their spatial relations between each other. So if you're in the Lane Center and you want to get to the baseball field, you would consult your cognitive map of the spatial layout of the FSU campus to decide which way to walk. Or if I asked you to draw a map of the FSU campus from memory, you would refer to your cognitive map. What we're going to do is to discuss common errors people make in their cognitive maps. So first, shape estimations tend to be more simplified than they actually are. In class, I have a volunteer draw what they think the state of Maryland looks like on the board. You can try this for yourself if you want. Feel free to sketch out the shape of Maryland on a notepad. Then I have them do the same thing for the shape of Iowa. Let's just say that their sketches rarely turn out accurately, demonstrating that people have errors in their cognitive maps of the shapes of these states. One common error is that angles of around 90 degrees tend to be misremembered as 90-degree angles. In one study, researchers had people estimate the angles of intersections of streets near where they lived. The intersections had real angles of 67 degrees, 63 degrees, and 50 degrees, but people estimated the angles to be 84 degrees, 78 degrees, and 88 degrees, so much closer to 90 degrees. In terms of the maps people draw of Maryland in class, well, this is really difficult to verbalize, but instead of drawing a 45-degree line from Maryland's far western border with West Virginia, they tend to make it a 90-degree angle. So they basically simplify the western border of Maryland by drawing a line from the far left bottom tip of the state to Frederick. Another error people often make in their cognitive maps of shapes is that curved lines tend to be remembered as straight lines, and lines tend to be remembered as parallel, even when, they're not. Going back to the map of Maryland, the southeastern region is often quite simplified, and people just draw straight lines instead of all of the contours there. Similarly, when people draw a map of Iowa, they draw all the borders of Iowa as straight. That is, their cognitive map doesn't contain the bulge in Iowa's eastern border, and so, and their cognitive map of the shape of Iowa is simplified. And additionally, then, people's cognitive maps have the eastern and western borders of Iowa as parallel to each other when they really aren't. Next, let's talk about distance estimations. So first, distance estimations are distorted by the number of intervening landmarks, which increases distance estimations. In one study, participants were shown a map of a made-up region populated with a number of cities and a legend to indicate distance. Between any two cities, there were 0, 1, 2, or 3 other cities. The subjects were then given the names of two cities and asked to guess how far apart they were from each other. What the researchers found was that when 0 cities were between the two cities they were asked to estimate the distance between, participants gave lower estimations than when there were 3 cities between them, even though the cities were the same distance apart from each other on the map. And so, the number of intervening landmarks increases distance estimations. Distance estimations are also distorted by crossing a semantic category, such as a country's border, which increases distance estimations. For example, on college campuses, 2 academic buildings are often judged to be closer to each other than an academic building and a dorm building that are actually closer because the two academic buildings are part of the same semantic category. In another study, when participants were asked to judge the distance between two cities, they gave larger distance estimates when the cities were in two different countries than when they were in the same country. So yes, crossing a country's border increased the distance estimations. And then finally, the landmark effect says that people provide shorter distance estimations when traveling to a familiar landmark versus traveling from a familiar landmark. So, let's say you leave from your house to a new restaurant, and then afterwards you come back to your house. The finding is that people give longer distance estimations. That is, they say it seems to take them longer to go from their familiar house to the restaurant than from their restaurant to their house, even though the distances are the same. So again, people provide shorter distance estimations when traveling to a familiar landmark versus traveling from a familiar landmark. And finally, I'll discuss some factors that distort relative position estimations in people's cognitive maps. So first, let me ask you a question. Which city is farther west? Los Angeles, California, or Reno, Nevada? If you said Los Angeles, you fell victim to the rotation heuristic, which says that tilted figures are represented as more upright in people's cognitive maps than they actually are. The idea is that this is what people's cognitive maps for the Western United States looks like. They picture California as being fairly vertical, so Los Angeles, which we know to be on the coast of California, is pictured to be west of Reno. However, California is actually quite tilted and actually looks like this in a real map. So in reality, Reno is west of Los Angeles. But again, the rotation heuristic causes us to picture California as being more vertical, more upright than it actually is, leading people to picture LA as being farther west than Reno. Here's one more question for you. Which city is farther north, Philadelphia or Rome? If you said Philadelphia, you fell victim to the alignment heuristic, which says that structures are represented as more lined up in people's cognitive maps than they actually are. The idea is that in our cognitive map of the world, we line up the United States and Europe, so that in our cognitive maps, southern United States is about the same latitude as southern Europe, and the northern United States is about the same latitude as northern Europe. In a real map, though, we can see that they are not that lined up, and in fact, the northern United States, where Philly is, has about the same latitude as southern Europe, where Rome is. And in reality, Rome is actually farther north of Philadelphia. So, based on all these errors people make in their cognitive maps, it's probably not too surprising that when we ask people to draw maps of the Earth, they draw something like this, which is pretty far off from what the actual map of the Earth looks like. Even worse is when you ask an American to draw a map of the Earth, you'd probably get something like this. Anyway, that's all for me today. Good luck with exam number 5. Post any questions on the discussion board, and don't forget that the memory paper is due this week.